Shri Gurubhyo Namaha Harihi Om. Namaste. Good evening all. I am Srinivasa Acharya, Srini, Assistant Professor and Coordinator of the Department of Philosophy at Manipal. If one wonders what is yoga, Patanjali, the author of Yoga Sutra, thus considered the father of yoga philosophy, defines in his second sutra, aphorism, yogaḥ chitta vritti nirodhaḥ. Today's speaker, Dr. Shyam Ranganathan, translates this aphorism as yoga is the control of the moral character of thought, or yoga is the control of the character of thought. We could see the linguistic similarity between a couple of Indian and European languages for this morph yoga. In English, it is yog. In French, joug. In German, yog. In Spanish, yugo, which may also refer to the gear that joins two draft animals. Nevertheless, they refer to the process of joining or coming together or union. Dr. Ranganathan translates it also as harnessing. However, most of the Vedanta philosophers, while commenting on Krishna's Bhagavad Gita, chapter 2, verse 39, translated yoga as upaya, moksha sadhanopaya, referring to Brahma Sutra's 3rd chapter, sadhanadhyaya, the means. Therefore, Patanjali's conception of chitta vritti nirodha is an upaya, yoga towards mukti, according to Vedanta. In this sense, Gita refers to this concept of yoga as samatvam yoga uchyate and yogaḥ karmasu kauśalam in chapter 2. Bananje Govindacharya, a renowned Vedic scholar of Udupi, translates them in Kannada as ಸಮಭಾವಕ್ಕೆ ಯೋಗವೆಂದು ಹೆಸರು, ತಿಳಿದು ಮಾಡುವ ಜಾಣತನ ಯೋಗ. Overwhelmed by these, we are struck with the question, are they saying the same or different? Actually, all are referring to the same through different operationalized definitions. Chitta vritti nirodhaḥ yoga. Chitta is a comprehensive term for all aspects of antakarana. That is, manas, buddhi, ahankara, chitta and chetaḥ. This manomaya kosha is also an avarana, layer of the sthula deha, embodiment, the gross embodiment. The vritti in which we engage or occupy ourselves through these antakarana, the inner faculty, and also therefore jnanendriyas, cognitive senses, are to be yoked by yoga's 8-fold methods. That is, the upaya Krishna elaborates in Gita's 6th chapter. That is why we have titled the Yoga Seminar Series, which is being held celebrating International Yoga Day, as yogaḥ karmasu kauśalam, yoga, an art of equanimity and agency. At the outset, I would like to share a few words about the organizing institutions. The Department of Philosophy, DOP, is a constituent unit of the Faculty of Liberal Arts at Manipal Academy of Higher Education, MAHE, an institution of eminence in India, Manipal. It incorporates teaching and research activities in the areas of humanities and social sciences through academic programs, projects, publications, and events. It has brought out a couple of scholarly translations and publications through the academic publishing house, Manipal University Press, MUP, and is conducting interdisciplinary research in the areas of philosophy, literature, digital humanities, and computational linguistics. The department is collaborating with the University of Toronto, Canada, on a project on Indian dialectics and argumentation funded by Shastri Indo-Canadian Institute City, New Delhi. In this project, we are together organizing text reading workshops on Nyayamrita, Advaita Siddhi with Sri Vidya Shisha Tirtha Swamiji of Vyasarajamata, formerly known as Professor Dr. D. Prahladachar, and Vidwan Sri Manidravida Shastrigal. It is also conducting a research on MAHE-Mahabharata computational analysis. With a team of young promising scholars, this project funded by MAHE has developed the first searchable digital concordance of Mahabharata's 3 critical editions and is now into subject indexing and grammatical analysis of the Indian epic literature. With the funding from the European Union, EU, the Department of Philosophy, in collaboration with the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence, Manipal Center for European Studies, is also organizing a 2-week summer school on Indian discourses on ethics and epistemology, hosting traditional and international scholars in a couple of months. With a team of faculty members who are the beneficiaries of globally prestigious Erasmus Plus Teaching Mobility and Raman Charpak Research Fellowships at European universities, the department offers 2 postgraduate degree programs, MA Indian Philosophy and MA Sanskrit Studies, apart from other courses in humanities. With young, vibrant team, it has been possible for us to achieve a few feats in the past couple of years. This seminar is the second in the series. The first one was on yoga philosophy in Bhagavata by Dr. Dhananjay Rao, New Delhi. In collaboration with the Indian Council of Philosophical Research, New Delhi, ICPR, this is the 3rd international seminar that our Department of Philosophy at Manipal is organizing in this calendar year 2021. We had celebrated the World Philosophy Day and International Women's Day on Indian thoughts on language, literature, and morality with contemporary women philosophers in India, and also had organized ICPR periodic lectures on MAHE-Mahabharata philosophical interventions as part of Manipal Mahabharata lecture series. On behalf of MAHE as well as ICPR, firstly, I cordially welcome Dr. Shyam Ranganathan, a renowned Indian philosopher from York University, Canada, our today's speaker. Welcome, sir. It all happened so quickly through a social media conversation. Thank you for accepting our invitation, Professor. My colleague and the coordinator of the event, Vidwan Gowtham, will introduce the speaker after the welcome. I also cordially welcome the organizers of the event, are Manipal University, MAHE, and ICPR. This event has seen a lot of registrations, more than hundreds, and I delightedly welcome the August gathering present here online, taking your time amidst your busy schedule, and all our students and colleagues. Now, I invite Vidwan Gowtham to introduce the speaker. Over to you, Gowtham.
Thank you, Srini. Namaste, Dr. Ranganathan. We are happy to have you here with us for the International Yoga Day Seminar Series. Namaste all. It is my privilege to introduce our speaker, Dr. Ranganathan, to you all. Dr. Shyam Ranganathan has MA in South Asian Studies and MA and PhD in Philosophy. He is a researcher, scholar, author, and teacher of philosophy and an expert in neglected traditions of Indian moral philosophy, which covers practical questions of how to live, what to aim for, and what we should value, including yoga. Dr. Ranganathan is author, editor, and translator of over 50 peer-reviewed scholarly works, including Ethics and the History of Indian Philosophy, published by MLBD in 2008 and in 2017. The Bloomsbury Research Handbook of Indian Ethics in 2017, and Hinduism, a Contemporary Philosophical Investigation by Routledge in 2018. He is a specialist in translation, having written his PhD dissertation on the topic of how we can understand texts without projecting our beliefs onto them. Dr. Ranganathan translated Patanjali's Yoga Sutra and published by Penguin in 2008. Today he will speaking on dharma-meghaḥ samādhiḥ, the moral rain cloud assessment, as part of the Yoga Seminar Series. Dr. Ranganathan, once again we welcome you, and over to you.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I'm going to, I'm sharing my screen. Can everybody see the presentation? Is this visible? Srinivasa, if you can see it. Oh, okay, great. Thank you. All right. I will not seek confirmation after this. All right. So, so when I use, there's two ways I attack or kind of dive into this topic. One way that I used to do a lot more is I would just start with more basic methodological questions of how, I would start with methodological questions of how we could possibly understand any philosophy and then proceed from there. But this topic of dharma-meghaḥ samadhi is interesting because it's a topic that addresses, or at least contains within it, the kinds of methodological considerations we would need to understand philosophy. And interestingly and importantly, the idea of dharma-meghaḥ samadhi, even though it's in the Yoga Sutra, it's listed as the penultimate event before kaivalya. So kaivalya is the final autonomy of the yoga practitioner when they stand on the pure power knowing, and before that, they have this event of dharma-meghaḥ samadhi. It's super important. It's not ever talked about, and I think the reason it's not ever talked about and people just talk about everything else is because in order to understand, in order to really address it, you have to address these methodological issues, and you have to come to terms with the reality that the Yoga Sutra and yoga is itself a distinct normative ethical theory, and also in many respects a meta-ethical theory. So anyways, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the text. And one concept that I think is pretty important is that of egotism. So egotism is this conflation, asmita is this conflation of an epistemic agent with their perspective. Okay, so when we're guilty of egotism, we don't draw a distinction between our outlook and ourselves. Okay, and this is an interesting idea because, and it's a kind of selfishness. When we come to Patanjali's description of the dharma-meghaḥ samadhi, it's articulated as this abandonment of selfishness, or selfish desires at least. When one attains this summit characterized by lack of selfish desires in all contexts and the ever-present discriminative knowing, there comes that dharma-meghaḥ samadhi. And so I struggled with how to render this. So dharma, I will set out the case for why dharma is always the concept of ethics, no matter what usage, anywhere in South Asian philosophy. It's always about ethics and morality. Samadhi, I confess, being being kind of perplexed about it. I think really to solve the problem of what samadhi is, we should look at what the Samadhi Pada is, which is book 1, where it potentially sets out several different kind of all the elements that you have to come to terms with in yogic practice, both the good and the bad, right? The various vrittis. So samadhi is a kind of final conclusion, a state of assessment where you review everything that would come about through some type of investigation, right? And so here I think the dharma-meghaḥ samadhi is this final assessment after you've taken dharma seriously. Okay, all right. So perhaps the most important event in yoga practice, upon achieving the state, all problems of the yogi terminate. Tata klesha karma nivrittihi. And the yogi stands on their own form without external interference. Okay, so right. So why is this important? That's kind of my topic. So okay, so now having alluded to the fact that these methodological questions are basically contained in these dense ideas, I want to take a step back and I'm going to review some more basic methodological considerations. So we should start with what a thought is. Okay, so this is all one of the things that's really impressed me as I continue to teach and do research as a philosopher, and a scholar of yoga is how these very basic concerns of philosophy are also basic concerns of yoga. So, right, so a thought, you have to understand what a thought is if you're going to engage in philosophy, because it's just this discipline about thinking, right? So thought is something that can be true or false, and it's also something that has inferential properties. Okay, these are two different ways to assess a thought. So consider, the thought, it is raining outside. If it's true, right, it entails that water is falling from the sky. So the proposition it is raining outside has an inferential property, namely that it entails that water is falling from the sky. And this is independent of the question of whether it's really true that water is raining outside, right? So we can assess the inferential properties of a thought independently of its truth or falsity. Now, in ordinary talk, and actually I think this has everything to do with the Western tradition. This doesn't really have anything to do with philosophy in the South Asian tradition. It has to do with kind of peculiar features of the Western tradition, that believing and thinking are confused. Okay, so belief is an attitude that a thought is true. Okay, so I might have the belief that it's raining outside. This is not the same as the thought it is raining outside, because when I have the belief it is raining outside, it's an attitude of endorsement of the thought it is raining outside. Okay, very easy to confuse the two, because when I articulate my thought, it sounds, or when I articulate my belief, it's indistinguishable from the thought I'm thinking, but it's importantly distinct. Okay, so a belief is just one of many possible propositional attitudes. You can have an attitude that P is true, you could worry that P is true, you could hope that P is true, right? All these are propositional attitudes. Now let's compare these, right? If I believe that, fear that, hope that it is raining outside, it does not follow that water is falling from the sky. Okay, so, and this is really important. This is something that analytic philosophers have periodically given notice to, but they haven't kind of talked about it enough. But if I instead of talking about a proposition, talk about propositional attitude, I've now changed the topic to what's often called an intentional context. And the inferential properties of intentional context are not the same as straightforward inferential properties of thoughts, right? So the proposition, it is raining outside, right, if true, entails that water's falling from the sky. But my belief that it is raining outside does not entail that there's water falling in the sky, because my belief is about me. It's about my attitude to the thought. It's not the thought. Okay, and so there's a logically important distinction to be drawn between believing and thinking. All right, now logic versus attitudes. Now, once we come to appreciate this basic distinction, there are all sorts of powerful outcomes. First is that logic is about understanding the relationship of thoughts in terms of inferential support, irrespective of the truth of the claims that we consider, right? In contrast, attitudes bind us to thoughts and undermine our capacity to be free from the influence of what we contemplate. Because when we relate to thoughts, not by logic, but by attitudes, we are attaching ourselves to the thought as something we either fear, hope, or believe is true. Okay, and this is really important. When we are engaging in logic, we're not assessing the inferential properties in terms of truth, right? So the proposition, it is raining outside, entails that water is falling from the sky, irrespective of whether it is really raining outside. Okay, so inferential properties, right, we call this validity. I should hopefully have well, anyways, I'll just say, this is kind of philosophy 101, but, what is it that philosophy professors need to teach their students so that they can understand an argument, right? The concept of validity. A valid argument is an argument where if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. This is absolutely necessary to understanding philosophy, and it's absolutely different from the question of whether the propositions are true or not. Okay, now, given the distinction between attitudes and reasoning, right, we can't do both. we can't do both at the same time. We can't relate to thoughts in terms of our attitudes and reason, because when we relate to our thoughts in terms of our attitudes, we're assessing it in terms of whether we believe or endorse it. And when we're engaging in logic, we're not considering that at all. We're looking simply at the relationships between propositions. So importantly, right, to do logic, you have to get over yourself. You have to get over your own egotism, because egotism is just this engagement in propositional attitudes where you conflate your outlook with yourself. And when you've conflated your outlook with yourself, you've conflated the things that you can contemplate with your attitude towards those things, right? And so this egotism then is just a rabbit hole to irrationality. And on the yoga account, this is the mark of selfishness. So selfishness or egotism is generated by this appropriative activity where we take something that's publicly contemplatable and then turn it into some type of personal definition via our own self attitude, via egotism. Okay, so getting back to dharma-meghaḥ samadhi, right? We can start to see the moral dimensions of this criticism of egotism, because when I'm egotistical, I have left a world, or I kind of removed myself from participating in a world where there are a diversity of perspectives, lots of different agents who are capable of viewing the same proposition from different perspectives, right? So when I reason, and we reason, right? Let's say we reason together. We don't have to agree upon the truth or falsity of the propositions in question. And so this is just so normal in philosophy. We study philosophers that we're not sure, we don't know if what they're saying is true. And we can disagree with each other about the truth or falsity of what they're saying, but we're nevertheless able to follow their arguments. So we can recognize each other as autonomous individuals who have different perspectives on what we're considering, and we don't make everything out to be about ourselves. Okay, but right, when we're egotistical, we make everything out to be about ourselves. So there is this interesting ethical dimension to getting over your own egotism. Okay, so now I said earlier, I want to make a case, or I have made the case, I'm going to review the case that I've made, that every occurrence of dharma, no matter where it is, in a philosophical text or anything of philosophical importance, has to do with ethics. Okay, and it's translatable as the English ethics or morality. Okay, but this is just more to this. If we can engage in this dharma-meghaḥ samadhi, then we get over the afflictions, etc. Okay. Before I get to that case, for why it is that the ethical significance of dharma is always ever present, I think it's important to appreciate how by the time you get to the end of the Yoga Sutra, right, potentially talking about the seer standing on their own, the pure power of knowing. Earlier, right at the start of the Yoga Sutra, we have almost a similar metaphor of the seer abiding in their own essence, the Dadrishya Swarupa Avastanam, right? And it's almost as like the Yoga Sutra has gone full circle. One of the things that, I noticed in my translation of the Yoga Sutra is that most translators just decide to pick and choose the meanings of the various words they want to translate, which seems to me to be wrong, because the whole point of a sutra text is to compress many meanings into an aphorism, right? It's a divisive economy, so you use words with lots of meanings on purpose. And vritti, right, one of the meanings of vritti is ethical behavior, conduct. And people just decide to filter this out because they've already decided, because of their egotism, right, that it's not relevant. They've already decided, they're not drawing inferences on the basis of the words used. They've already decided what is and what is not relevant to understanding the text. But if you start to notice then that there's an ethical dimension to vritti, and that there's this kind of repeat of a metaphor of kind of autonomy on one's own form, dharma-meghaḥ samadhi is super important to understanding the very beginning of the Yoga Sutra. It clarifies what's involved. Okay, and kind of the short answer is that when we do yoga, chitta, vritti, nirodha, we push back on the normative claim that what we're contemplating makes on ourselves, and that provides us a certain room to be an individual. This is exactly what happens when we reason. When we reason, we're not buying the normativity of the propositions we're considering. We're rather arranging them into an argument. And that allows us a certain freedom to contemplate whether we should agree or disagree. But this activity of simply not buying everything you contemplate is an ethical activity because it involves getting over your egotism. All right. Now, my method for thinking about philosophy is what I call explication. So explication is the activity of using deductive validity as a means of understanding philosophy. Now, where did I learn this from? I think I learned this from my philosophy professors. All of them. They would give us like a ton of reading on a topic from several different authors, and our job as philosophy students, and I'm thinking back to my very early years as an undergrad, is that we would have to use our logical skills to derive from the reading a theory articulated by the various agents. If it's a dialogue, there might be various theories, but let's say it was like just a monograph, there's like one theory and maybe some critical theory. We'd have to use our logical skills to extract a theory that entailed all the controversial claims made in those texts. And then we take a step back and then we understand the topic of discussion in terms of the disagreement across the competing theories. Okay, now the reason why this is a super important and absolutely necessary means of understanding philosophy is that it bypasses propositional attitudes because it's purely based on logical validity. So, right, when you study philosophy, you can be completely agnostic. You don't have to believe anything you are reading because nothing depends upon what you believe. Right? It's completely an opportunity for you to work on getting over your own ego, to understand the philosophical implications of theories, and then to understand the topic as something that's controversial. Okay. Now, if you were to do this to Indian South Asian texts, you would notice that, like, well, first of all, dharma is a word that appears everywhere. But if you follow this methodology, you would have to extract a theory of dharma from all the claims that various philosophers and darshanas and texts make, like each relativized to each author or philosophical agent if it's in a dialogue. You'd have to locate a theory derived via validity, a theory that entails that perspective's various claims about dharma. And then you would have to compare these theories of dharma to isolate the concept of dharma, which is what everybody's disagreeing about, which is the right or the good. Okay, so theories of dharma. So one of the things that I've been making the case for this for a long time, is that what doesn't happen in the study of South Asian philosophy, or hasn't, at least until I started complaining about this, is that this activity, which is just a normal activity for the study of philosophy, right? Instead, people would come at this with their egotism and decide on a case-by-case basis what dharma meant. Right, so I was just kind of floored. I was a graduate student. I just finished an undergrad and a master's degree in philosophy, and then I went into South Asian studies, and I couldn't believe that this was just the way everybody approached South Asian philosophy. They would look on a case-by-case basis where dharma was being used in a text and decide on the basis of their own propositional attitudes what dharma meant, and they would correlate the usage of dharma in the South Asian text with what they, as an outsider, would have been willing to say in that same case. So the weird thing about this methodology, and I saw this as an undergrad, is this is exactly what all the bad students of philosophy did, right? They would come to Plato or Aristotle or Kant or whoever with their beliefs, and they decide on a case-by-case basis what Kant, Aristotle, whoever, they would decide to cash out that philosophy in terms of what they would say in that context, and then complain that it made no sense, right? And of course, it made no sense because they weren't using reason or logic to follow the argument. Yet this was just normal. Is this kind of normalized, institutionalized violence against South Asian philosophy, where you don't think you should read it as philosophy, you just treat every usage of a word as an opportunity for you to correlate it with your ego, right? Very bizarre. There's an explanation for why this ends up being institutionalized. But anyways, right, if you adopt this, and I call it, this is interpretation. In the literature, this method where you explain everything in terms of what you believe is called interpretation. If you do this, basically you end up destroying South Asian moral philosophy, because every usage of Dharma won't be tracked as part of a large-scale disagreement on the right or the good. It'll all be tracked in terms of the propositional attitudes of the people interpreting, right? So so indulgents do what unsuccessful students of philosophy do. It's not just like an isolated case. This is just like kind of what everybody has been doing. And what they do is then they interpret. So I review in the Encyclopedia of Religious Ethics, I have an article where I review the history of the theorizing of interpretation and its application to South Asian philosophy. Okay, now when you interpret, you explain A's perspective by way of what you, the explainer, take to be true. This violates logic. And I think this is the most important point. It's not just that this is unethical, it is. It's unethical to try and understand everybody in terms of your own beliefs because you're erasing their own individuality. But it violates logic, because logic is not about assessing propositions in terms of what you take to be true. It's about trying to understand inferential support. Interpretation only works in cases where you agree with what the author is saying, right? In every other case, it produces noise, right? And so the idea that somehow South Asian philosophy is like religious and spiritual, that's an artifact of interpreting it. That's an artifact of using a non-rational, non-logical approach to the study of South Asian philosophy. So interpretation is this totally ego-driven activity. Explication is this non-ego-driven activity, right? Insofar as I use logic to understand the implications of various claims that further entail the claims of the perspective, and then I understand the topic in terms of the disagreement, I have completely circumvented any type of reference to myself in my understanding of others. And so I was recommending this, and then one day I was like, oh, this is kind of what's just at the start of the Yoga Sutra, right? The Yoga Sutra begins with the contrast between two methods of engaging in mental content. And explication is a version of yoga, Chitta Vritti Nirodha, right? Where we push back on the claim of thought to our obedience, right? And then that allows us a certain epistemic autonomy to evaluate the possibilities. That's what we do when we explicate. And then if we fail to do that when we interpret, we simply explain everything in terms of what we're inclined to believe. But then the thoughts that we contemplate influence us. All right. Now, if you interpret, right, it leads to this kind of common myth, this nonsense, right, that South Asian philosophers didn't do what we call moral philosophy. Right, that assessment is completely an artifact of the methodology of interpretation, and importantly, it's an outcome of the methodology of just not studying South Asian philosophy like philosophy. Okay, and it leads to all this nonsense in the literature. We cannot reduce the meaning of Dharma to one general principle, nor is there a single translation. Dharma is one of those Sanskrit words that defy all attempts at an exact rendering, right? These views about the kind of the oddness of Dharma as a concept are a function of interpretation, because as you interpret, you try to correlate the usages of Dharma in terms of what you would say, those contexts. And insofar as there's a divergence between the views of the people you're trying to understand and yours, there's going to be a kind of fragmentation of the correlation between what you would say and what they would say when they use the word dharma. And then it results in the kind of the literature that we have, where South Asians are depicted as these idiots who can't speak their own language. There's no rationality that ties the various usages of dharma. I'm always surprised that people don't kind of realize how kind of weirdly insult. It's as though like these people can't speak their own language. They somehow don't understand what they're saying. It makes no sense. Now, if we explicate, right, what we would do is we would follow the disagreements about dharma across philosophical positions. And we would notice that there are actually 4 basic ethical theories. Okay, so one of them is virtue ethics, the idea that the good virtue or strength produces right action. Next is consequentialism, the good end justifies the right means. Deontology, the right reason justifies the good action or mission. And there's room for a 4th ethical theory. So we're used to these first 3 ethical theories from the Western tradition, but there's room, when we explicate, we see that there's room for one more that's the mirror opposite of virtue ethics. The right action produces the good. That's bhakti/yoga. So, right, if we look back historically, Plato, Aristotle, theism is a version of virtue ethics, right? God is the ultimately good agent whose preferences constitute what we should do. Jainism and Vaisesika in the South Asian tradition are both versions of virtue ethics. Confucius and Lao Tzu in the Chinese tradition are also that. Consequentialism, right? You see this a bit in Aristotle. Certainly Buddhism, Nyaya, Bentham Mill, Mosey. Deontology, Kant, legalism in China. In South Asia, we have Purva Mimamsa, and the karma yoga of the Bhagavad Gita is a form of deontology, right? Where there are these good things we're supposed to do, but only some of them count as the things that we should actually endorse, right? And those things end up being our swadharma. And the things that we should endorse out of the many good things that we can do are the things that are somehow agent relative to ourselves, like something to do with our existential context. And practicing it is our contribution to a world of diversity. And then finally, there's this absolutely unique or unusual ethical theory of yoga/bhakti in the South Asian tradition. And so, right, it starts off in the Upanishads, Bhakti Yoga, Bhagavad Gita, the Yoga Sutra, and then Ramanuja for sure. So when we think back about when we take stock of explication as a means of understanding the South Asian tradition, not only is the traditional myth that South Asian philosophers weren't interested in moral philosophy not true, but they had more moral philosophy than in the Western tradition, insofar as they also contemplated one extra ethical theory, Bhakti Yoga. So all of these ethical theories are very much part of the South Asian tradition. And when we observe the ubiquity of the word dharma throughout the tradition, we see that this was their basic concern. Their basic concern was moral philosophy. And the various usages of dharma in the tradition aren't best understood as distinct meanings, but rather distinct theoretical applications of the word in deference to the various theories that South Asian philosophers use. So you can understand dharma then in kind of on 2 levels. One, in terms of the theoretical application within a specific theory of dharma in the South Asian tradition, and then in the abstract in terms of what everybody was disagreeing about. Okay. So what's yoga bhakti? Yoga bhakti is this idea that right action is devotion to the procedural ideal of right action, Ishvara, and the good is just a perfection of that practice. So goodness is not a defining feature of the right. And this sets out yoga/bhakti from the other 3 ethical theories, that goodness is not a basic moral notion, it's derivative. Okay, and so what Patanjali does is Patanjali defines Ishvara in book 1 as a special kind of person untouched by afflictions and actions, or afflicted actions, and untouched by effects of actions and stores. So Ishvara is capable of governing itself and instituting its own plan, and is also not stuck in the past. And so what Patanjali does then at the start of book 2 is he takes these 2 defining features of Ishvara and then sets them out as 2 distinct practices. So tapas is the practice of not being stuck in your past or being unconservative, and swadhyaya is the practice of self-governance or choosing your own values, right? You choose your own Ishtadevata as you practice swadhyaya. And both of these are then constitutive of being devoted to Ishvara or sovereignty. Okay, and then I noticed over here there are all these kind of interesting images that kind of evoke Lakshmi as someone who sits on herself, right? Swarupi Avastanam, Swarupi Pratishta, being own master. Now, Bhakti is, and I used to do this too before I started thinking clearly about these things. Bhakti is often depicted as a version of theism, but theism is a version of virtue ethics, right? So Bhakti is the opposite. So Bhakti is not theism, not at least in the yoga, not in the standard Yoga Sutra form. And so Bhakti is a kind of atheism. All right. But, and I think this is interesting, I think it's important for us, if we're decolonizing our understanding of the South Asian tradition, to think about ways in which people had to express these philosophical ideas, right? So one day I was looking at this tableau, which we're all probably familiar with, Adisesha, Lakshmi and Vishnu floating over this ocean. And then I realized, oh, this is Yoga Sutra Book 2, Sutra 1, over Yoga Sutra Book 1, 2 to 3, right? So the ocean is the chitta vrittis in the background that are receding. And what allows you to overcome it are the 3 kriyas of yoga. So Adisesha being Ishvara Pranidhana, and Vishnu being tapas, because he's got all of these manifestations of past actions like the gada, like the disc that don't interfere with his presence. And then Lakshmi is someone who owns her own choices. And when she's depicted as lotus sitting on herself, she's literally also self-governing. And then because Vishnu is able to practice tapa, or is tapas, he's able to allow new things, right? He's getting over his past, and that makes room for something new, which is why Brahma comes from the navel. So, and this, this will at the end be somewhat important, but the way that we go about, or the way that South Asian philosophy has been, or the South Asian tradition has been studied via interpretation, problematizes South Asian philosophy and philosophical modes of expression, and then depicts it as religious or spiritual. And then when we explicate, we start to see that even the symbols and ideas that were celebrated were ways to explore and celebrate philosophical ideas that you could provide an argument for. All right. This stuff should be, it should be kind of obvious, but it isn't always obvious. But when we look to the Yoga Sutra, sorry, just checking my time. When we look to the Yoga Sutra, I'm running out of time. Okay, I better speed up then. We see this distinction between Purusha and Prakriti, between the ought and the is, right? Prakriti is causal explanation from the outside, and Purusha is this normative explanation. And when we live as people, we live in accordance with these basic practices of yoga. These are normative. Okay. Now, this talk was introduced by way of reference to Vedanta philosophers calling yoga an upaya, but that's not the way the Yoga Sutra talks about upayas. The only thing that's an upaya, rather, are the 8 limbs. So yoga is a basic normative practice. And in fact, even the first limb of the Yoga Sutra, the Mahabharata potentially says is a universal obligation. So, but nevertheless, it's the 8 limbs that are described as upayas in the Yoga Sutra. And then when we take a look at what yoga education has become, right, what ends up being chakra, the yamas and the niyamas. So the yamas are kind of the preparation for the possibility of the practice of yoga. And that preparation involves disrupting systemic harm that allows social facts that depict people with what they need, not deprived of them. So that's ahimsa, satya, asteya. And then personal boundaries are intact, brahmacharya, and then no one is engaging in hoarding or acquisitive behavior. If you engage in yoga's chitta vritti nirodha, you have drawn those appropriate social boundaries because you've gotten over your own egotism. And then the niyamas, just the second limbs, just celebrate yoga as a normative practice as 3 kriyas, Ishvara, Pranidhana, Tapas, and Svadhyaya. Those get dropped in the way people talk about yoga, right? So yoga then becomes asana and pranayama, even yoga day, right? When you take a look at the pictures of celebrating Yoga Day, it's people doing asana. You don't see people doing moral philosophy, which would be kind of the way yoga should be celebrated if we take, you know, the previous two limbs seriously as well. Okay, so why? So why is it that we've come to the point where we've dropped any reference to the moral philosophy of yoga, and then yoga is reduced to this kind of technique of wellness, okay, where it's just about asana, etc. And the explanation is interpretation, right? So if we are going to approach yoga via our own beliefs, and we don't have these beliefs about yoga being a normative ethical theory, it gets expunged from the way yoga is talked about. And this has everything to do with the westernized world, right? In the westernized world, yoga is taught as this kind of thing, this asana practice or this pranayama that you do. And then somehow the choice of ethical theories is independent of all that. And you could, you know, maybe be some type of virtue ethicist, like a Plato Republic type who thinks that there's a guru that has to dispense yoga teaching, right? Or you might, you know, engage in some kind of consequentialist reasoning. Oh, I do yoga because it brings about good outcomes. Or, you know, deontology, where there are these, I just have these practices that I do because, you know, I have special reason to engage in it. Okay, so I'm coming towards the end of my presentation, but the source of kind of the misstudy of South Asian philosophy, and also this kind of excision of the ethical content of the Yoga Sutra, has to do with the very core of the Western tradition, which is the linguistic account of thought. The linguistic account of thought goes back to the ancient Greek idea of logos, where there's one word for thought, reason, language. And if you think that thought is the meaning of what you say, then to explain a thought, you have to explain it in terms of what you say. And then to study thought, you have to study language, right? Which is why in a westernized world, when two things happen. First of all, when the vast majority of academics try to study South Asian thought, they don't study philosophy because that would involve explication. They're rather interpreters. Why are they interpreters? They're interpreters because they buy this idea that thought is linguistic. So then what we find is instead linguists and philologists as the primary drivers of academic discourse on South Asia. And that's just a manifestation of the Western tradition. But it also explains why no one is actually explicating, or very few people, maybe, you know, present company excluded, is explicating, because the linguistic account of thought encourages interpretation, right? Because if I have to explain a thought in terms of what I would say, I've blurred the line between what I can think and what I believe. And basically it's egotism. Okay, and then as this tradition spreads, because language is this human thing that occurs within communities, right? It creates anthropocentrism and communitarianism. Colonialism is a way to deal with others who are not part of one's own linguistic community. You basically have to go force them to be. And then, of course, it also gives rise to nationalism. It's hard to articulate nationalism without linguistic identity, proselytization, and the idea of religion. Okay, so what ends up happening, right? So where are we at in the study of South Asia, right? It's dominated by this idea that it's a tradition of religion and spirituality. This too is a result of the Western tradition that ends up repurposing the Roman idea of religio as a way to talk about all non-Western traditions, right? So everything that counts as a world religion does not have roots in Europe. Surprise, right? And this has nothing to do with the content. So if we explicated, we would notice that that the same things that are said by European philosophers can be found in various religions and vice versa. But what holds this whole distinction intact is interpretation by way of the Western tradition. So religion is then the racialization of BIPOC intellectual traditions, right? And the whole point, this is just one example, reality is an evolution of matter and there's no afterlife, said by European secularism, said by Sankhya philosophers, right? Ishvara Krishna basically says that in the Sankhya Karka, Hinduism, right? You ought to choose so as to minimize suffering, said by Bentham, utilitarianism, said by the Buddha, religion, right? Religion is just kind of a manifestation of the of the interpretive incompetence of the Western tradition, because interpretation is incompetent, right? Plato, right, believes in a life after death and God. He's secular, but if you find this position from the Middle East, it's just religion. So Hinduism, right, we should all know this, originally a Persian term, not an Indian word, used by the British to talk about the entire South Asian intellectual tradition as though one religion. And so if we explicate, we can see pre-colonially, it was this massive disagreement about dharma. It was a philosophical disagreement about moral philosophy. Post-colonially, if people buy the West and its interpretive methodology, there's this search for some type of unified perspective that everybody shares. And this unified, the shared perspective is not something you come about by explication, but it's rather about shared beliefs. Okay. So anyways, this is my book, Hinduism, A Contemporary Philosophical Investigation, where I explore some of these ideas. So to the question, like, why is it that we've come to the point that nobody talks about dharma-meghaḥ samadhi, and yoga then ends up being this kind of, this simply an upaya, simply something you do for some extra measure, and not itself a basic ethical theory we should take seriously? Well, it has to do with the colonialism of the Western tradition, and specifically interpretation, right? And so decolonizing our understanding of South Asia would involve getting over our ego, embracing explication, and then understanding how the Yoga Sutra, for instance, is a sustained contribution to our understanding of the disagreements in moral philosophy. All right, that's my presentation. And I will now hand it back to the organizers.
Of course. Thank you so much, Dr. Ranganathan. And my name is Tanima. I'm a lecturer at the Department of Philosophy. So hereafter, I will be asking my own questions as well as taking the questions that have been posted in the chat box. So I'll be moderating the session hereafter. So please stay with us as there are a host of questions waiting for us in the chat box. So I think I'll just take this opportunity to ask my question first. So there's something that I am particularly interested in and I'm also working on is the concept of desire in philosophies across cultures. And I couldn't help but notice that when we were speaking about the summit of yogic practice, we speak of, somewhere you mentioned, is the selfish desire. And is there an unselfish desire as well? Is there a desire which is unselfish?
Yeah, wonderful. So I think the one important way to understand how yoga is so different from Buddhism is that desire in the Four Noble Truths is marked out as bad no matter what. But you don't find that in yoga-related literature, right? Some desires are bad. And I think that's because in yoga, desire isn't the problem, but belief. Belief is really the basic problem. Because when we endorse propositions as true, we cement our own egotism. And that creates selfish desires, where the things that we want are somehow just peculiar to ourselves. So if we can get rid of egotism, then what we want is just fine. There's no categorical problem with desire. So selfish desire then is just a symptom of egotism, and egotism is the construction of the self in terms of belief. And that's why I think, even though there is some similarity between Buddhism and yoga, they are importantly different, right? So you shouldn't desire your own annihilation. So the Buddhists talk about the problem, because the problem is desire, and that has to do with egotism. You should deconstruct yourself and simply realize yourself to be part of the dependently originating elements of the universe. The other view is that, well, hold on, you need to take yourself seriously as the source of, as the locus of your own responsible life, right? So in order for me to assess what I should do, I have to have an understanding of myself as an abstraction from any possible choice. And then I have to understand myself as responsible for choosing. And that way of relating to myself as transcendent of my actual context It means I have to take myself seriously as the same person over time who can make different decisions, some good, some bad. And I have to want that. If I don't want that, it's a kind of irresponsibility, right? Like, you know, every now and then we hear the weird story of someone who decides they're going to become a, you know, they're going to seek. I hear about it more in the West. Maybe it happens in India too. But people decide that they're going to seek, become basically a sannyasi and then leave their family or something weird like that, right? Like, you should want to have those relationships where you can perfect your responsibility. And often people will articulate the rationale for just abandoning those obligations as, oh, I should just get over all my worldly desires. That's just not a yoga idea.
I think somewhere it's about being able to distinguish between certain kinds of desires and the ones which you will be, you know, you should be following, and the ones which you shouldn't be. Yes. So there's some, so wonderful, because honestly, in the popular culture, usually people think of it as a state of ultimate desirelessness. And I often wonder if that's really possible. If it's really possible to be a human being without having any sort of desire.
Oh, yeah. Well, the our desire to be a human being should also be something we get rid of, right? So that would be the Buddhist response. That desire to continue on in some kind of human form would also be as something I should get rid of. I think what's really interesting about, so one of the reasons I bring up the correlation between yogic practices and, say, Vishnu, Lakshmi, etc., is that it helps us see that, first of all, there's a long history of association of Vishnu in the articulation of the philosophy. It goes back to the Katha Upanishads, where Yama is articulating yoga probably for the first time, and he talks about yogic success is taking you to the realm of Vishnu. And then Krishna comes back in the Gita to articulate yoga. And these are not accidental, right? I think people think that it's just, it's a way of treating that idea as a personal ideal. But then, of course, these stories are also filled with romance and love and personal friendships. It's hard to understand all of that if desire were a bad thing, right? So you know, I think when we can explicate and we get over having to understand everything by way of our own propositional attitude, we can then look at the wider literature in which yoga is articulated and think about these as thought experiments, where the ideas of yoga, like what happens when agents make these kinds of decisions, etc. And you start to see the themes of yoga starting to come through, which have a lot to do with the right kinds of desires too.
Okay. Of course, somewhere this prompts me to ask a couple of more questions, but I think I'll let other participants also have this opportunity to ask their questions. So I'll just begin by taking the first question posted in the chat box, which is, what is the difference between Turiya Avastha and Samadhi?
Sorry, what is the, this is
I think you might, yeah, it's in the chat box. I think you'll have to
go to the okay.
Okay, I don't think it's there in the chat box. It was communicated to us privately.
Oh, okay.
So I'll
okay, so I can tell you what samadhi is. I need to know. So this is very important. When you're talking about a phrase, you have to locate it within a text or within a perspective to then understand what philosophical work it's doing. So it's difficult for me to kind of just answer that question in the abstract. Samadhi, I think, has to do with well, at least if we look at the way the word samadhi is used in the Yoga Sutra to talk about book 1, and then at the end as something that comes at the end of the 8 limbs, but then also something that shows up in the dharma-meghaḥ samadhi. It's a state of conclusion. I translate it as like absorption. But you know, I think that was probably not so perspicuous. So Surya Avastha, what was the alternate?
Turiya Avastha, it was. Turiya Avastha.
Yeah, I need to know the actual kind of text of the location it shows
the textual
up.
reference, yes.
Yeah, to answer that question. So this is also important, right? So some words you can give very general answers to because they are the topic of disagreement across the tradition. So the reason why I'm so confident that Dharma is just about the right or the good is that that's just the only thing that everybody's disagreeing about when they promote their distinct views on Dharma. They're disagreeing about what counts as the right choice, what counts as the good outcome, and the priority of each. So it's possible to give a very high-level general answer to that question because Dharma is what I call a key philosophical term. It's what everybody's disagreeing about, or they're using this word to articulate disagreement. Other philosophical words are not of this sort. They are far more theory bound and far more specific to specific arguments or premises. So we'd have to look at the details then.
Okay, never mind. I think we can just take the next question. We have a lot of questions to address today. So I think you may be able to look up this question in the chat box because it has been shared with everyone. So
Okay.
it says, I'll read it out nevertheless. Professor, today, the term yoga has been referring to asanas. However, philosophically speaking, the term refers to restraint of thought, therefore emotional. How does this popular understanding of yoga being reduced to asanas has originated historically?
Yes. So yoga, so yoga, even in the Yoga Sutra, potentially gives more than one way to define yoga. So there, at the start of book 1, yoga is yoga chitta vritti nirodha. Then at the start of book 2, yoga is a 3-part kriya. So I think it's important to take all of this into account. And you know, when we also look historically in the Upanishads, when say Yama's talking about yoga, it's this activity of coordinating your mind, body, senses to allow for the thriving and safety of the individual. And then when you look at, you know, in the Bhagavad Gita, for instance, Bhakti Yoga ends up being basically the theory of Ishvara Pranidhana in the Yoga Sutra. So I think if we look at yoga as outlining a theory, it's a robust theory of moral philosophy. Then we look at the today where yoga is asana, and there's a long, I view this as the end result of a long process of colonialism. So South Asia has been subject to colonialism for centuries. And what ends up happening in colonialism is, colonialism is the denial of philosophical alternatives, right? It's the imposition of a perspective on a people. And as even South Asians and Indians accommodated themselves to this colonialism, they did so by, well, how would you accommodate yourself to colonialism? By not challenging the basic outlook and just kind of shrinking into a smaller and smaller space, right? So the end result of thinking of yoga as just asana seems to me, and not a substantive moral philosophical position, is the end result of colonization. In defense of, say, people like, say, Krishnamacharya or others who taught yoga asana and who ended up being very influential, they were aware of yoga as a philosophical option. But the uptake in a westernized world and India, to the extent that people just think that yoga is asana, that's also a sign of westernization, right? It's a sign of adopting the outlook of the colonizer. That's a result of the political environment that people choose to operate in. Interestingly enough, yoga is the source of the philosophy of decolonization, right? So you engage in practices of harm disruption that challenge egotism. And so I think if, you know, yoga practitioners are in a good position to decolonize yoga, but then we would have to get over this idea that it's just asana, right? But, you know, that means we have to do moral philosophy, which is great.
Of course, and I think that a very key message that I personally received from this talk is a very grave reminder that, you know, the principal concerns of philosophy are also the principal concerns of yoga, which just emphasizes the point that yoga is both practice and philosophy, which is, I believe, most of us are forgetting today. Since I think today our participants are from different academic backgrounds, so some of the questions might be interesting as well as a little generic in nature. However, I would take them up here. So one of our participants has asked, I wish to know more about what entails South Asian philosophy, and what are the key schools or traditions of thought which are included in that? How, you know, probably contemporary scholars, you know, understand South Asian philosophy?
Yeah, well, so there's no way to answer that without doing some philosophy oneself. So, you know, one of the things that's become clear in my research is that if we understand philosophy as this theoretical disagreement about basic concepts of descent, the South Asian tradition is a huge tradition of disagreement where all the options, there are South Asian versions and flavors of it, but all the basic options are there. So the reason that South Asian philosophy is not understood is that it's not studied as philosophy. It's studied primarily by, especially in the West, linguists and philologists who then interpret South Asian philosophy in accordance with their beliefs. And then it's depicted as a tradition of religious schools. So if we really want to learn about South Asian philosophy, we have to practice the skill of thinking philosophically, which is explication, which I talked about. And then that unlocks all the options.
That's, I think that sums up at least a part of it. Okay, so there's a special question posed by one of our students, and so I'll just take it forward. Namaskara, Professor. You mentioned the need to embrace explication based on logic over subjective interpretation. Is logical explication devoid of all subjectivity possible, especially when dealing with verbal testimony, where language is involved and hermeneutics invariably comes into picture?
So the argument for explication is a rejection of hermeneutics and the interpretive tradition. Hermeneutics in the interpretive tradition is a theory of understanding based on the linguistic account of thought. The linguistic account of thought says thought is the meaning of what you say. If you buy that model of thought, yes, of course, interpretation's always involved, but that's just a basic model of thought from the Western tradition. It's the model of thought that gives rise to colonialism, because everything has to be then explained in terms of what that tradition would say. A yogic approach to thought, or a philosophical, so we need an alternative. And in my work on translation and philosophy, I talk about alternatives, but importantly, we can think about this question in terms of translation. When translators, real translators, translate text, they don't translate languages. They translate works of a specific genre type, and then they recreate a text with new semantic resources. But the success is not measured in terms of a kind of a one-to-one correlation, but in terms of the macroscopic recreation of the genre-specific features. Okay, that's an example of yoga chitta-vritti nirodha, where you're not allowing the linguistic meaning of a text to influence you. You're taking a step back and you're trying to see, well, how does this function to create a semantic whole? And then how can I recreate this with different semantic resources? It's just what you would do when you're recreating a work of art in a new medium. You don't worry about the parity between elements in one medium and the other. You look at the form, but you need some type of third criterion of equivalence, which is going to be disciplinary. So then you have to understand, so if you're understanding philosophy and translating philosophy, you have to understand what's relevant to philosophy. and that's going to dictate what you save in your translation. But same goes for understanding. When you're looking at linguistic claims, if you don't understand what philosophy is, you're not going to understand what's relevant for you to take away. So so I don't think that interpretation, I think that very idea, it's kind of part of the propaganda of the Western tradition, that no matter what, we're always explaining in terms of our perspective, right? That's an attempt to normalize colonialism. And I think yoga is an important response to that.
Okay, so yes, there's another question that I'd take up, and perhaps after that we will perhaps wrap up the session if there are not many questions left. Okay, so this question says, so I think it is making a reference to one of your translations. In your Yoga Sutra translation, you have translated vikalpa as verbal delusion, panchavrittis. How come the verbal qualifier has been added in the translation to the idea of vikalpa? Does that leave out any other form of delusion?
Oh, I see. Well, right. So translation. So if you're going to, so here's the translation approach I was employing. So first you have to decide what type of text you're translating, and that's a choice. So I chose philosophy. We could translate the Yoga Sutra as a work of drama or poetry. It would make bad drama. It might make interesting poetry. I don't know. But whatever you choose is going to dictate what features of the text you treat as salient for reproduction. The next challenge of translating a sutra text, especially the Yoga Sutra, is that it's comprised of words that are polysemous. They have many meanings, and they're all meant, or at least you have to assume they're all meant, because the whole point of a sutra text is to compress lots of ideas into small aphorism. So now how do you re-say all of that in another language where the words don't share the same polysemy? Well, you have to make a decision in terms of what's important. What is the governing theme of the sutra relative to the argument on the whole, and then how you can save all the meanings in terms of this kind of this hierarchical level of importance in the translation. And so then the translation isn't supposed to stop you from thinking about the text. It's just supposed to preserve enough of the ambiguity, enough of the depth, that then as you start to process it, you can start to think about the argument. So there are all sorts of ways to think about vikalpa, etc., that will go beyond, say, verbal. But the sutra is about atanyana. It's about in shabda. It's about language. And so that's just the way I ended up translating it. I just figured that's what if you take a look at all the words that are there, right, that's what's going on.
I think translation is at the heart of Indian philosophy today, because there are such, so many, several translations available in English and other languages as well. So our next question is somewhere related to the activity of translation itself. And it says, what are the key steps one has to follow to translate the crucial technical terms of a particular philosophical schools into English or any other language?
Right.
I think they're seeking your advice as a translator.
Okay, so you have to understand what philosophy as a kind of textual endeavor is. And so what I see is that there are kind of tiers of terminological importance. Some words are just the words everybody is using to articulate their disagreement, like dharma. And you'll be able to find these words as the words that everybody's using, but using differently. Okay, so that's your clue that everybody's disagreeing about that. And so you have to basically follow. You can't look at the importance of a text in the abstract. You have to take a step back and consider how it's contributing to a disagreement. So this is exactly what doesn't happen. Everybody thinks that somehow they're going to specialize in a specific school, and then they don't realize that they're missing the forest for the trees. So you first need to take a step back. And then once you've done that, you can go back and you can look at the words that are more peculiar to traditions, and then treat them as having a meaning in terms of the theory about the major controversial terms. Okay, and then once you've understood these more peculiar school-specific words as playing a theoretical role in a theory about dharma or pramana or tattva or whatever kind of major philosophical disagreement there is, then you have a way to understand how you can translate it, because you understand how that word is playing a role in the argument, the controversy, the argument that the text is contributing to a controversy.
Okay. I think we'll stop the question answer round here and probably move towards the conclusion of this session. So for anyone who had a pressing question and wasn't able to ask, you can communicate to us later. For now, I think we would conclude this session. So now that we have arrived at the conclusion, I think I can say this, that no event is ever managed without a vast network of people who are, who make it happen, who turn this event into reality. So I take this opportunity on behalf of the Department of Philosophy to thank all those people who made this event a reality. So first of all, we thank Professor Dr. Ranganathan for accepting our invitation in the first place, and also sparing the time to put forward his views in the most captivating manner. And there are several takeaways from this talk, and I hope each and every person who has ever been associated with yoga or was actually planning to, consider yoga in their life would not only just look at it as a practice, was also consider it as a philosophy, both thought and body. So I also take this opportunity to thank the Indian Council of Philosophical Research for extending financial support, and of course, Manipal Academy of Higher Education for their continuous institutional support. I also take this opportunity to thank our neighboring departments and the heads of neighboring departments, that is Professor Nita Namdar from European Studies, and Mr. Rahul Putti from Department of Languages, and of course, our very own Manipal Universal Press, which is our own academic press. And with this, as an emblem of our gratitude, we would like to present you with two ebooks, which are accomplished publications at Manipal Universal Press. One of them is Ayurvedic Inheritance by Professor M.S. Valayathan, and another one is a condensed version of Valmiki's Ramayana by M.R. Parmeshwaram. So I hope with this, we also receive an opportunity to collaborate and publish with you sometime in the coming future. And so last but not the least, I thank all the participants who remained with us today and who posted their wonderful questions. And of course, the organizing team at the Department of Philosophy, my colleagues and comrades. So thank you, everyone. We hope to see you again in this yoga seminar series. And thank you once again, Professor Dr. Ranganathan. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Take care, please.
Bye-bye.